He didn't whisper it. He pointed at her in front of 500 soldiers and laughed. They sent us a headline. Major Grant Halden announced loud enough for every man on that field to hear, instead of an operator. The laughter spread through the formation like fire through dry grass. Lieutenant Rowan Hale stood inside that sound and didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't reach for a single word to defend herself. She simply waited still and certain until the laughter peaked, crested, and began to fall. Then she looked directly at Halden and asked the only question that mattered. "Are you finished, Major?" He wasn't. But in 5 days before those same 500 soldiers, he would be. If this story already has you leaning forward, subscribe to this channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The Joint Warrior Crucible had been running for 11 years without a moment quite like this one. 500 soldiers spread across the Nevada high desert in the gray pre-dawn of a Monday morning, standing in formation with the kind of collective focus that comes only from people who have spent years learning that attention is its own form of discipline. They'd arrived from Fort Bragg and Camp Pendleton, from training bases in Georgia and Washington State, from posts in Germany and Okinawa. Army Rangers, Marine Raiders, Navy Special Warfare Operators, Air Force Combat Controllers, the best of what the Joint Service community produced, gathered on the pale dust of Camp Granite Ridge for 5 days that would separate the excellent from the exceptional. The Crucible wasn't a popularity contest. It wasn't a ribbon ceremony or a promotional event. Every man on that field knew its reputation. The physical demands were brutal. The tactical problems were designed to break your assumptions, and the leadership pressure was relentless and public. You failed in front of people who would remember it. You succeeded in front of the same people, which meant there was no coasting, no hiding behind paperwork, no claiming credit for what a subordinate accomplished. The Crucible stripped away everything that rank could protect and left behind only what you actually were. That Monday morning, Grant Halden owned that field. He stood at the center of the front formation, with the particular ease of a man who had earned the right to stand there and knew it. 37 years old. 6 feet 2, 230 pounds of maintained functional muscle. 3 combat deployments with the 75th Ranger Regiment. 2 Distinguished Service Medals. An award from the Secretary of the Army for his work developing the Ranger Assessment and Selection Program's revised endurance standards. His record was not manufactured. His reputation was not borrowed. Every soldier standing in that formation had heard his name before arriving, and most of them had arrived with the quiet hope of watching him perform. The problem with Grant Halden, the precise specific problem, was that he had learned something useful from his career, and one thing deeply wrong. What he'd learned correctly: standards matter, and the people who enforce them protect everyone beneath them. What he'd learned incorrectly: that the standard was his, to define that he understood the full shape of human capability because he had tested it in himself, and that anything which didn't fit the blueprint he'd built from his own body and his own experience was by definition lesser. I wasn't cruel in the common understanding of the word. He didn't enjoy watching people suffer. He enjoyed watching them measure up, and he had decided long before Lieutenant Rowan Hale stepped off a transport aircraft at Nellis Air Force Base exactly what measuring up looked like. It didn't look like her. Rowan arrived with a single bag and 3 other members of her evaluation team. She was 29 years old, 5 feet 6, and built the way people are built when their fitness serves a specific operational purpose rather than a visual one. Lean through the shoulders, strong through the hips and legs, with the kind of posture that comes from years of controlling her body in water and on rock and in confined spaces where the wrong movement costs lives. She had dark hair pulled back without ceremony, and she moved across the tarmac with the particular quietness of someone who had spent a long time learning that unnecessary noise draws attention you cannot always afford. Her record to most of the soldiers who would compete against her was essentially invisible. Lieutenant Rowan Hale, Naval Special Warfare Command, 5 years of service following Bud S., the first woman to complete the SEAL qualification training pipeline under the integrated standards the Department of Defense implemented 37 months earlier. Beyond that, almost nothing was publicly available. 3 of her deployments were sealed at the classification level that ends most conversations. 2 commendations that existed only in documents requiring a security clearance to access. A record that told people almost nothing, except that she had been trusted with things that couldn't be discussed in formation. The problem with a classified record, in an environment full of people who measure each other through shared stories and visible accomplishments, is that it looks like an empty one. Sergeant First Class Dale Mercer, who'd been running Crucible logistics for 6 years, was standing near the registration tables when Rowan signed in. He watched Halden clock her arrival from across the staging area, watched him take in her height, her build, her quiet lack of performance, and saw the calculation happen behind Halden's eyes in about 3 seconds. Mercer had seen that look before. He'd spent 6 years watching men make that calculation, and he knew what it predicted. He just didn't know yet how badly wrong Halden was about to be. The opening formation assembled at 0530. The Crucible Director Colonel Reese Pemberton delivered the briefing in his characteristic style, direct, economical, without theater. 5 days. 12 primary events. Teams of 6 assigned by draw rotated after each phase. Individual and team scores tracked separately. No seniority protection, no rank deference during events, and absolutely no exception to the physical standards that applied equally to every competitor, regardless of service branch or prior achievement. Halden had heard it before. He stood near the front of the formation with 2 of his training partners from Fort Lewis, and half listened to Pemberton, while his attention kept drifting professionally, instinctively, the way a competitive animal scans a field across the assembled faces. He found Rowan standing 3 rows back, arms relaxed at her sides, watching Pemberton with the steady attention of someone who reads every room she enters as a potential operational environment. Halden leaned toward the man to his left, Captain Derek Saunders, and spoke at a volume calibrated precisely for the 4 or 5 people nearest him to hear. "You see the Navy's contribution to our readiness exercise." Saunders looked. "SEAL. Supposedly." Halden's voice carried a particular texture, not contempt exactly, but the cousin of contempt that wears the face of skepticism. "They sent us a headline instead of an operator." Saunders said nothing, but the men on either side of him heard it. And they passed it along the way. Things always pass informations in a low current of sound, person to person, until it reaches the person it was designed to reach. Rowan heard it the way she heard most things, completely and without visible reaction. Colonel Pemberton finished the briefing. The formation was preparing to break when Halden did something that would later become the moment everyone in that field remembered above all others, at least until the 5th day gave them something larger. He stepped forward out of formation without requesting permission. "Colonel," he said, addressing Pemberton, but projecting his voice for the audience he had, "before we begin, I think the standard here should be the same for everyone. No accommodations, no modified events." He turned and looked directly at Rowan. "Some of us have carried wounded teammates under real fire. Some of us have records that actually tell you what they've done. I think the assembled company should be able to see what everyone here is actually capable of before they follow someone into an event." 500 soldiers went very quiet. Colonel Pemberton's expression didn't change. "Is there a specific request behind that statement, Major?" "A demonstration," Halden said. "Standard casualty carry, the 250 dummy, full course." He held Rowan's eyes. "I think the field should see what Lieutenant Hale can actually do before we start calling her a team leader." It was a trap constructed from several working pieces. The 250-pound training dummy was the heaviest in the Crucible's equipment inventory. The full course was a 400-meter loop over broken terrain with a steep gradient on the back quarter. Most male competitors could complete it, but it was deliberately sized to expose the gap between people who trained for it and people who hadn't. And doing it cold in front of 500 people before the event had even officially begun meant doing it without warm-up, without team support, without any of the contextual preparation that turned a physical challenge into a performance rather than a test. Halden was betting she'd decline, or struggle visibly. Either outcome served him. Rowan looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Colonel Pemberton. "Sir," she said, "do you want this done?" Pemberton was a careful man. He understood exactly what Halden had done, and exactly what his own response would communicate to 500 soldiers. He gave the question 3 seconds before he answered. "That determination is yours, Lieutenant." Rowan nodded. She walked to the equipment rack at the edge of the staging area, pulled the 250 dummy from the rack, with both arms, settled it across her shoulders in the standard carry position chest, to the back. Arms locked beneath the dummy's full body weight, distributed across her trapezoids and posterior chain, and turned to face the course. She didn't rush. She didn't perform. She didn't look at Halden or at the 500 people watching her. She began to walk. Check time. What happened over the next 4 minutes and 17 seconds would be retold with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment for the remainder of the 5-day crucible, and well beyond it. But the essential truth was this. Rowan Hale carried 250 pounds of dead weight across 400 meters of broken Nevada terrain at a pace that would have been considered acceptable for that weight, even for an experienced male competitor. And she did it without breaking form, without slowing significantly on the gradient, and without releasing the carry until she reached the finish marker. She placed the dummy down with controlled precision. Not dropped, not fallen, placed the way you place something you intend to pick up again. The 400-meter field was quiet for a beat and a half. Then someone in the middle of the formation started clapping, and about 60 other people joined before the sound scattered. Halden didn't clap. He watched her walk back toward the formation with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, and when she reached him, he said quietly this time, without the audience projection, "That was rehearsed." Rowan looked at him. "So was yours." He blinked. "Every one of us has rehearsed," she said. "That's called preparation. The difference is what you do when the script runs out." She settled back into her place in the formation. "I guess we'll find out." Colonel Pemberton called the formation to order, and the crucible began. The first event was a timed obstacle navigation. 6 kilometers of terrain, with embedded tactical decision points, scored on both speed and the quality of choices made at each point. Teams were assessed on how they used available resources, how they protected their slower members, and whether they correctly identified which risks were acceptable and which ones were traps. Halden's team hit the course like a controlled explosion. He was at the front from the first side, setting a pace that forced everyone behind him to either match it or acknowledge they couldn't, and 3 of his team members were experienced enough to match it. They burned through the first 4 kilometers in 41 minutes, which was fast enough that Mercer, watching the tracking board, whistled quietly to himself. Rowan's team left 2 minutes later in the staggered start sequence. She didn't go to the front. She went to the second position, just behind a Marine corporal named Trevino, who was clearly fast and eager, and she spent the first 2 kilometers watching not the terrain primarily, but her team. Specialist Owen Price was Army. 24 years old, a combat medic from the 82nd Airborne, who'd volunteered for the Crucible as part of his evaluation for Special Operations Medical Selection. He was fit and willing, and slightly terrified of failing in front of people he respected, which made him push harder than was strategically wise in the early kilometers. Staff Sergeant Louis Calderon was Marine Infantry 32, with 2 combat tours and the particular solidity that comes from having been in genuinely bad situations and made it through them. He was watching Rowan the way a man watches a bridge before he commits his weight to it, assessing load capacity, looking for cracks. 2 Air Force combat controllers rounded out the team. Both experienced, both competent, and both currently suspended in a state of neutral assessment. They would follow whoever proved worth following. At the 3-kilometer mark, Rowan's team reached a fork in the route. The left fork was faster, flatter terrain, cleaner, footing the obvious choice. The right fork added roughly 6 minutes, ran along a higher ridgeline, and required more effort. Trevino started left. Rowan said hold. Trevino stopped, looked back. "Give me 30 seconds, she said. She wasn't asking. She crouched and studied the junction. The left fork soil was a different color than the surrounding terrain. Darker, with a particular texture that she had seen before in training environments near water sources, where the surface compacts after saturation. The grade on the far side of the left fork led downward into a narrow ravine. She looked at the sky, checked the wind direction, looked at the ravine walls. "Right fork," she said. Trevino frowned. That's 6 extra minutes. I know. If we lose 6 minutes on the first navigation, we're starting the whole crucible in a hole. Yes, Rowan said. Right fork. There was a beat 3 seconds of visible resistance, and then Calderon said, I'm going right. And that settled it, because Calderon's credibility with the group was enough that when he moved, the others moved. They went right. 11 minutes later, as Rowan's team was completing the ridge section, they heard it from below, a deep, wet structural sound, like the earth clearing its throat. The left fork ravine had collapsed. Not dramatically, not a cinematic wall of dust, but enough. A section of the route, roughly 40 meters long, had given way, dropping 2 to 3 feet, creating an impassable obstacle that would have stopped any team caught inside it, dead in its tracks. From the ridge, Rowan's team looked down at it in silence. Owen said softly, How did you know? Soil color, Rowan said. Recent saturation from an underground source. The grade into the ravine was too steep for the soil density. I've seen that combination before. She was already moving again. 6 minutes isn't a hole. 6 minutes is the price of not losing 30. Calderon fell into step beside her. He didn't say anything, but the way he adjusted his position slightly closer, slightly less angled away, communicated what he thought more clearly than words would have. Owen pulled even on her other side. Where did you see that combination before? Can't tell you. He glanced at her. Classified. Classified. He nodded slowly. Okay. Owen. She looked at him. The fact that I can't tell you doesn't change what it means. It happened. I learned from it. That's enough. Yes, ma'am, he said. And then after a pause, it's enough for me. The first day's scoring posted at 1800 hours. Halden's team placed first in speed. Rowan's team placed first in decision quality, a category that counted for 30% of the overall navigation score, more than most competitors budgeted for. In combined scoring, the two teams were within 2 points of each other, with Halden holding the edge by virtue of his time advantage. The mess facility that evening was louder than usual, with the particular noise of people who have been tested and survived and want to process it. Halden ate with his team at the long table near the east wall, and their conversation carried the satisfied energy of people who have performed and know it. Across the facility, Rowan sat with Owen and Calderon. She ate with systematic attention, said relatively little. But she was listening, cataloging the way she always cataloged the sounds and patterns and social architecture of a new environment. She heard Halden. Specifically, she heard him when he said to the table general, "The decision scoring is designed to protect people who can't keep up physically. It's a bureaucratic accommodation dressed up as a tactical metric." Several people at neighboring tables heard it too. A few nodded. A few said nothing and looked at their food. Calderon across from Rowan watched her face. "You want to say something?" "No," she said. "You sure? Because I know what he's doing." She took a drink of water. His opinion of the scoring system matters a lot less than whether his team can adapt when the scoring system changes. She set the cup down. Day 4 has a decision weight event worth 60%. He'll build his lead on speed for 3 days, and then discover he can't hold it. Calderon was quiet for a moment. "You've read the full event breakdown?" "I read everything I'm given access to," Rowan said. "That's also preparation." Owen was watching her with an expression that was slowly reorganizing itself from cautious assessment into something closer to allegiance. "Major Halden told 3 people in the locker room that you're only here because the Navy needed a female face on the joint exercise program." Rowan nodded once. How many of those 3 people believed him? Owen thought about it. 2 of them probably. The third one looked at the scoreboard. "Good," Rowan said, one at a time. The second day's events were where the story of the Crucible began to shift. And the shift was not dramatic. It was incremental. The way real things change, person by person and moment by moment, until enough individuals have changed that the collective position is different, and nobody can point to the exact instant it moved. The morning event was a medical triage simulation. 6 casualties, varying severity, limited equipment, time pressure, and a secondary complication introduced at the 40-minute mark. Most teams excelled at the initial triage and began failing when the secondary complication. A simulated structural instability in the casualty collection point forced them to make decisions about movement under deteriorating conditions. Halden's team stabilized all 6 casualties in good time, and then when the structural instability was introduced, proceeded to argue about the correct response for 4 minutes before their senior medic made a unilateral call and got them moving. They finished with 2 casualties in the critical category, not failed, but not excellent. Rowan had told Owen before the event began that he was the lead voice on all casualty assessment. She would handle logistics movement decisions and structural risk. Calderon would manage security and secondary complications. Owen had stared at her. "You want me to lead? I'm the lowest rank on this team." "You're the most trained for this specific event," she said. "Rank is for organizational structure. Events have their own architecture. You're the right person for this one." He led. He was good, better than good, working with a focused clarity that comes from being given real responsibility by someone whose judgment you've started to trust. The secondary complication hit, and Rowan called the structural assessment in 12 seconds and had the team moving before Owen finished his casualty priority call. They worked around each other rather than over each other, and it was the kind of thing that the evaluators watching from the gallery above would later describe in their notes as genuine integration, not a team performing coordination, but a team that had actually coordinated. Rowan's team completed the event with 0 critical casualties. The evaluator who wrote the score, a Navy commander named Araujo, went over the notes 3 times before submitting them because she wanted to be sure she wasn't awarding credit that wasn't there. It was there. At the water break following the triage event, Owen sat on the ground next to Rowan and looked at his hands for a moment before he spoke. "I've been in 3 exercises before this one," he said. "No one has ever told me to lead a triage event." "No one noticed you could," Rowan said. "Or they noticed and didn't care." "Or that," she agreed. He was quiet. "Then, why do you notice?" Rowan thought about it for a moment, not performing consideration, but actually considering. "Because I spent a long time being in rooms where the person with the most experience was told their experience didn't count for the right reasons. I got very good at noticing who actually knows what they're doing." She looked at him. "You know what you're doing." Owen looked at the scoreboard posted on the near wall. Rowan's team first in triage. Halden's team third. "He's going to say the triage event is weighted wrong," Owen said. "Probably," Rowan said. "And then we'll do the next event." By the end of the second day, the chatter had changed. It wasn't quiet anymore, the particular kind of quiet that forms around a subject everyone is discussing, but nobody wants to be caught discussing. Now people were talking openly in the way soldiers talk when the facts on a scoreboard have given them permission to say what they've been seeing. In the barracks that evening, a group of Rangers were having a conversation that Halden would not have appreciated. "She called the ravine collapse before it happened," one of them said. "I heard about that," another said. "Soil density or something." "Who reads soil density?" "People who've worked in environments where missing it gets someone killed," the first one said. Then he added after a pause, "Which is what a SEAL does." Another silence. "She's sitting at top of the decision scoring across every event," someone said from a bunk in the back. "Halden's still top on speed. Day 4 has the 60% decision event." A longer silence. The man on the back bunk looked at the ceiling. "He's going to have a problem." "He's going to have several problems," the first man said. "He just doesn't know it yet." Day 3 brought the urban rescue simulation. This was the event that the senior evaluators discussed most in the after-action reviews, not because of any single spectacular performance, but because of what it demonstrated about the difference between a team that is built around its leader and a team that is built around the mission. The simulation was a collapsed 4-story structure, a training village that Camp Granite Ridge maintained specifically for this purpose, with 12 simulated casualties placed at varying levels of accessibility. Some were straightforward extractions. 3 of them required solving an engineering problem before the casualty could be moved. One of them was in a location that required the team leader to make a decision about acceptable risk entering a structurally questionable section in real time under time pressure. Halden's team extracted 9 casualties in the allotted 45 minutes. The 3 engineering casualties stalled them. Halden's instinct was to push forward and gather the accessible casualties first, which was a rational choice, but it meant that when they returned to the engineering problems, they were running low on time and high on fatigue, and the precision work required by the engineering extractions suffers when you're tired and rushing. His team solved 2 of the 3. The third was marked incomplete. The evaluators scored his team second overall behind Rowan's. What Rowan's team did differently, she went to the engineering problems first. Her reasoning, which she explained to the team in under 30 seconds during the initial assessment walk, was simple. The accessible casualties will be accessible in 45 minutes. The engineering problems get harder as we get more tired. We solve the hard problems while we're fresh, and we trust ourselves to move fast on the easy ones at the end. She looked at Calderon. Do you trust us to move fast at the end? Yes, ma'am, he said. Then let's go. They solved all 3 engineering problems. Then they swept the accessible casualties in a controlled sprint that Calderon led with a physical efficiency that was notable enough that 2 evaluators in the gallery were talking about it. Final count: all 12 casualties extracted 2 minutes and 13 seconds under the time limit. When the scores posted, Halden was standing at the board with his arms crossed. He turned to Saunders. She went to the hard ones first because she knew she couldn't compete on speed at the end. Saunders said nothing for a moment. Then, Grant, she finished 2 minutes under time. Halden said nothing. She finished 2 minutes under time and she got all 12. Saunders kept his voice even. That's not managing weakness. That's strategy. Halden walked away from the board. That evening was the 3rd night, and the camp had the particular energy of a competition entering its decisive phase. 2 more days remained. The individual scoring showed Rowan leading in tactical judgment, rescue control, and decision quality. Halden led in speed metrics and raw power assessments. In combined scoring, which weighted all categories equally, they were separated by less than 4 points, with Rowan fractionally ahead. The information moved through the camp. The way information moves in competitive environments, rapidly, with editorial commentary from each person who passed it along. There was a group of soldiers younger, mostly from different branches, who had been watching Rowan since the first morning. Not the way Halden had watched her with assessment designed to find inadequacy. They watched the way you watch something you didn't expect to understand and have slowly started to. They'd seen the ravine call. They'd seen the triage leadership. They'd seen the engineering problems. One of them, a young Air Force controller named Pemberton, no relation to the colonel, said to his bunkmate that night, "I keep waiting for her to do something that I can explain by luck." His bunkmate said, and every time I think I've found one, someone who was closer tells me why it wasn't." His bunkmate was quiet. "The ravine thing is getting told a lot." "The ravine thing is getting told a lot," Pemberton agreed, "because the ravine thing was real." He stared at the ceiling. "Halden's been in more firefights than she has," he said. "Probably, based on what we can see of their records." "Yeah. But here's the thing." Pemberton sat up. "I've been around guys with a lot of firefights. Sometimes the guy with the most firefights is the best operator in the room. Sometimes he's the guy who keeps finding firefights because he doesn't know how to avoid them." He looked at his bunkmate. "Which one is Halden?" The bunkmate thought about it for a while. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "But I think we're going to find out before this is over." He was right. They all were going to find out. Just not in the way any of them expected. It was Owen who found out about the extraction. He'd been talking to a senior logistics coordinator, a master sergeant named Briggs, who'd been attached to Nissalbau's training units before his current assignment. And Briggs had mentioned Rowan's name the way you mention a name you've been turning over in your mind. "She was with a maritime recovery unit about 2 years before she came to Crucible," Briggs said. 3-operator team, small boat operation in water so cold it'll stop your heart in 8 minutes. Boat went over. IED in the water of all things, contact mine old unstable. 2 of her teammates went under. She went back in twice, got both of them out. Owen had gone very still. And then what? And then she had hypothermia, and 2 operators with combat injuries, and no boat, and 3 kilometers of open water between her and the extraction point. Briggs looked at his coffee cup. She rigged a flotation structure out of their gear and towed them both, 3 kilometers, in water cold enough to kill you. Owen was quiet for a moment. She received a commendation for that. She received a classification level for it, Briggs said. Commendation exists, can't be publicly cited. Mission was sealed 6 months before it was over. Owen sat with that information for a long time. He went back to where Rowan was running through the next day's event breakdown. He could tell that's what she was doing from the particular quality of her stillness, and sat down across from her. I heard about the cold water extraction, he said. She looked at him. She didn't ask how he'd heard, which told him she knew the story still moved through certain communities. You carried 2 people 3 kilometers, he said, in water cold enough to be fatal. I used a flotation structure. I wasn't carrying them in open hands. Ma'am, you know that's not what I mean. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she looked back at whatever she was mentally reviewing. I did what the situation required. Halden said today in the mess that you've never carried a wounded teammate under real fire. In real conditions. Owen kept his voice neutral. He said your record is sealed because there isn't much in it. Rowan was quiet for 5 full seconds. He watched her face and saw almost nothing. Not hurt, not anger, not the particular tension of someone deciding whether to defend themselves. What he saw instead was something closer to a decision already made long before this conversation. What do you think? She asked. I think I just learned about the cold water extraction, Owen said. I think your record is sealed because what's in it can't be discussed. That's correct. So what do we do about Halden saying it? Rowan looked at him steadily. Nothing. Nothing. A record can tell people what I survived, she said. My choices will tell them who I am. What Halden says about a record he's never read is information about Halden. It's not information about me. She turned her attention back to her mental review. Tomorrow is day 4, the 60% decision event. I'd like you to sleep. Owen stood. He was 3 steps away when he stopped. Lieutenant? Yes. I want you to know something. He turned back to face her. I came here thinking the best outcome for me was to be seen performing alongside the best operators in the room. I wasn't thinking about what I could actually do. I was thinking about how I'd look. He paused. You changed that in about 36 hours. Rowan was quiet for a moment. That's worth more than the Crucible, she said. He nodded. He walked to his bunk, and he lay down, and he slept, which was the most tactically correct thing he could have done. Day 4. The 60% decision event was a command and control simulation that ran for 4 hours and produced in Halden's case the moment he had been moving toward without knowing it since the opening formation. The event structure was complex. Each team leader operated as an incident commander for a multi-element scenario, managing resources across 4 simultaneous problem sets with incomplete information, evolving conditions, and a secondary crisis introduced at the 90-minute mark. Halden was excellent for the first 90 minutes. He was decisive. He was fast. He communicated clearly, and he used his team's physical strengths with the efficiency of someone who had spent years developing that instinct. His resource allocation was aggressive and rewarded by the simulation's early conditions. He was by any reasonable measure performing at the level his reputation promised. Then the secondary crisis arrived. In his scenario, it took the form of a communications failure combined with a simulated casualty in one of his secondary elements. Not a physical casualty, since this was a command simulation, but a leadership casualty, meaning one of his team leaders was marked as incapacitated and removed from the element. Halden's response was to assume direct command of the incapacitated element himself, which meant abandoning his incident commander position for 18 minutes. Those 18 minutes cost him 3 of his 4 simultaneous problem sets. The evaluators noted it without comment. The scoring algorithm did not need to comment. Rowan's scenario was different in its specifics, but similar in its design. Her secondary crisis introduced a resource conflict. 2 of her 4 problem sets required the same specialized asset, and she had to make a real-time decision about which one to prioritize, knowing she couldn't satisfy both. She spent 45 seconds thinking. Which sounds brief, and was, but 45 seconds in a crisis simulation is perceptible. It's the kind of pause that can make evaluators wonder if you're freezing. Then she called her element leaders to a 30-second group assessment, took their input, made the call, delegated the deprioritized problem set to her most capable element leader with explicit authority to make independent decisions, and returned to her incident commander position. The element leader she delegated to was Owen. He made 2 decisions without checking back with her, both of them correct. And when he reported them after the event, he used the specific language she'd taught him without knowing she was teaching it. I assessed the available resources, estimated the acceptable risk, and acted on what the situation required. Rowan's team solved 3 of 4 problem sets cleanly. The 4th was marked partial credit. Halden solved 1. When the scoring posted at 600 hours on day 4, the combined standing was no longer close. Rowan led by 22 points. Halden stood at the board for a long time. Saunders stood beside him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the board hadn't already said more clearly. A group of younger soldiers near the board were talking quietly, and Halden could hear fragments of it not intended for him, not designed to reach him. Just the natural conversation of people processing something they'd watched happen. Knew she'd have the lead by day 4. She read the event weights from the beginning. Halden's been competing against his own record this whole time. She's been competing against the scenario. That's the difference, isn't it? He came here to prove who he is. She came here to... Halden walked away. He didn't want to hear how the sentence ended. He didn't need to. He already knew. The final day was tomorrow, and it was going to decide more than a Crucible championship. 22 points. That number followed Halden from the scoring board to his bunk, from his bunk to the mess hall, from the mess hall, back to the board where he stood and looked at it again, as if the second reading might produce a different result. It didn't. Rowan Hale led the Joint Warrior Crucible by 22 points with 1 day remaining. The math was uncomfortable but simple. Halden would need to outscore her by 23 points in a single event to take the overall championship. The final event was weighted heavily toward adaptive judgment and team integration, the 2 categories where she had outperformed every competitor in the field across 4 consecutive days. Saunders found him at the board for the second time and said nothing, because Saunders was smart enough to understand that there are moments when a man needs a witness more than he needs advice. He stood beside Halden and looked at the numbers and waited. "She's been 3 moves ahead since day 1, Halden said finally. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't entirely contempt either. It was the particular tone of a man reassessing a situation he had badly misread and not yet certain what to do with the information. "Yes," Saunders said. "The ravine, the triage, the engineering problems, the command simulation." Halden's jaw was tight. Every event she went at it differently than anyone else in the field. Yes. And every time it worked. Saunders said nothing. Halden turned from the board. "She's been competing against the design of the exercise, not against me." He said it the way a man says something he doesn't entirely want to be true. "I've been competing against my own reputation." Saunders looked at him carefully. "Grant, don't." "I'm going to anyway." Saunders kept his voice level and low. "What you said in that opening formation. What you've been saying in the mess every night. The men have been listening. And the men have been watching the scoreboard. And right now, those 2 things are producing a conversation that you're not going to like." Halden said nothing. "You told them she was a headline. You told them she was a publicity accommodation. You told them her record was sealed because there wasn't much in it." Saunders paused. "And then she outscored you in every decision-weighted event in the Crucible." Another pause. "The men aren't confused about what that means, Grant. They're just waiting to see what you do about it." Halden walked away without answering. But he didn't sleep well that night. And the part of him that was still beneath the record, and the reputation, and the confidence that had calcified into something less useful than it used to be, The part of him that was still honest knew exactly why. Owen couldn't sleep either, but for entirely different reasons. He lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Briggs had told him. The cold water, the contact mine, the 3-kilometer tow through hypothermic ocean, and tried to reconcile it with the woman he'd been watching for 4 days. The woman who explained her decisions before she made them. Who told him to lead the triage event and then stepped back and let him lead it. Who said a record can tell people what you survived, but your choices will tell them who you are. I thought about that sentence for a long time. He thought about his own record. 2 years of combat, medical support. 3 soldiers whose lives he had saved in conditions that were not theoretical, not simulated, not scored by evaluators in a gallery above the action. Real, bloody, irrevocable. And he had walked into this crucible thinking that none of that mattered as much as being seen standing next to the right people. He sat up at 0200 and found Calderon awake on the opposite bunk, arms crossed, looking at nothing. "You thinking about tomorrow?" Owen asked. "Thinking about the last 4 days," Calderon said. Owen nodded. "The command simulation." "The command simulation," Calderon agreed. "She gave me the authority to make independent calls and then didn't second-guess a single one of them." He was quiet for a moment. "I've had commanding officers for 12 years. You know how many of them have done that?" Owen waited. 2, Calderon said. "In 12 years, 2. He looked at Owen. And both of them were the kind of leaders that the men would follow into genuinely bad situations without being ordered to. Owen said, "She's going to win tomorrow." "She's already won," Calderon said. "The scoreboard just hasn't caught up with what actually happened out there." He settled back. "The question is what Halden does when it officially catches up, because that's going to tell us something too." Owen lay back down. He thought about that for a while, what Halden would do, what it would tell them, what it would tell the 500 people who had watched both of them across 5 days. I thought about the 2 paths available to a man in Halden's position. The path that costs something and means something, and the path that costs nothing and means the same. He fell asleep not knowing which one Halden would take. None of them knew yet. But the final day was 8 hours away, and it had something in it that none of them had planned for. Day 5 began before the sun had fully committed to the Nevada sky. Colonel Pemberton assembled the full field at 0530, all 500 soldiers, for the final briefing. The morning air had the particular bite of high desert autumn, the kind of cold that wakes your lungs up and makes everything feel slightly more consequential. People stood close together without acknowledging it, the unconscious warmth-seeking of human bodies in cold air. Pemberton laid out the final event with his customary economy of language. A full-scale disaster scenario inside the training village. Each competing team would operate as an independent incident command, navigating a damaged structure to retrieve an encrypted mission beacon and evacuate a 200-pound casualty sled to the extraction point. The scenario would evolve in real time. Evaluators would introduce complications. Teams would be scored on speed, decision quality, casualty protection, and leadership under deteriorating conditions. Then, Pemberton said something he hadn't said at any previous briefing. "I want to be clear about one additional parameter. This exercise will test what you do when the mission you trained for becomes a different mission than the one in front of you. Every one of you has experienced that reality in the field. Today we're going to see how you respond to it here." He paused. "Dismissed to staging." The formation broke. Halden moved to the staging area and found Rowan already there, running through equipment checks with Calderon and Owen. She worked with the methodical focus of someone who had already run this scenario 100 times in her head and was now verifying that reality matched the plan. He walked directly to her. She looked up. "Strategy cannot replace strength," he said, keeping his voice controlled, "when someone's life is truly in your hands." The words were designed to land. They did. He could see the slight shift in Owen's posture, the way Calderon's expression tightened. But Rowan herself received the statement the way she received most of what Halden delivered, completely without performance. She straightened. "Then today we'll learn what strength is for." She held his eyes for exactly 1 beat. Then she turned back to the equipment check, and that the turning back the return to work was somehow more pointed than any further response could have been. Halden walked to his own staging area. His team was ready. He was ready. 23 points was a significant gap, but the final event was complex enough and physical enough that a dominant performance could theoretically close it. He told himself that. He kept telling himself that, right up until the moment the scenario started, and everything that anyone had planned became irrelevant. The first 20 minutes went according to design. Halden's team entered the training village from the east approach and moved with the controlled aggression that was his trademark, fast, physical, decisive eating through the simulated obstacles with the kind of energy that made evaluators in the gallery above sit forward. They located the first structural complication, solved it with direct force, and were moving toward the beacon location ahead of schedule. Rowan's team entered from the west approach and moved differently. A tighter formation, more communication between members, a slightly lower pace that felt deliberate rather than hesitant. She navigated 2 structural assessments in the first 10 minutes that slowed them fractionally, but preserved the team's energy for the back half of the scenario, where physical and cognitive fatigue typically degraded performance. Evaluator Commander Araujo, watching from the gallery, said quietly to the assessor beside her, "Watch her resource management. She's spending 20% less team energy than Halden in the first phase, and she knows exactly what she's saving it for." The assessor watched. "What's she saving it for?" "Whatever comes next," Araujo said. "She always knows something's coming next." What came next arrived at the 23-minute mark, and it was not in any evaluator's script. Chateg. The steel support frame on the north side of the training village's second structure had been flagged in a maintenance report 6 weeks earlier. The report noted minor fatigue stress in the lower connection points and recommended a scheduled inspection before the next high-load exercise. The inspection had been scheduled. It had also been delayed twice due to logistics conflicts and simply not completed before the crucible began. The collapse wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't the kind of structural failure that brings down a building. It was a single frame, approximately 400 kilograms of steel, which gave way at the lower left connection point and came down at an angle fast and loud and completely real. It came down in Halden's lane. He had 1 second of warning, a sound that experienced operators learn to recognize, a deep metallic groan that means something load-bearing is no longer bearing its load, and he used that second correctly. He shoved Corporal Reyes clear with both hands. Reyes went left, hit the ground and rolled. Halden went right, which was the wrong direction. The frame caught him across the left side shoulder, hip and leg and drove him down with the particular mercilessness of unplanned physics. The exercise stopped. An evaluator's radio crackled. Someone in the gallery was already on a phone. Halden was conscious. He was also trapped the lower section of the frame across his legs. The upper section angled against the wall above him, an unstable geometry that made direct extraction dangerous. Loose concrete from the wall had come down with the frame and was blocking the fastest approach for the rescue crew moving from the perimeter for approximately 90 seconds. The field was the particular kind of quiet that falls when something real has interrupted something simulated. Then Rowan's voice cut through it from the west approach. "Calderon. Owen. On me. Now." She had heard the collapse from 40 meters away and was moving before the evaluator's radio finished its first transmission. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for instruction. She assessed the sound, assessed the direction, assessed what it meant, and moved. Calderon reached her in 4 strides. Owen in 6. "It's structural," she said, already moving toward Halden's lane. "Frame came down. He's trapped. The rescue crew can't get to the fast approach." She looked at Calderon. "You've done confined space extraction." "Twice," he said. "Real world." "Good. Owen, your casualty assessment the second he's clear. Don't touch him until I say." She looked at both of them. "This costs us the event. We cross into his lane, our run is disqualified. You understand that?" Owen said, "Yes, ma'am." Calderon said, "Already moving." She crossed the lane boundary. The evaluators in the gallery saw it happen, and one of them said, "She just disqualified her team." And Commander Araujo said, "Write down exactly what she's doing, and why," and didn't take her eyes off the field. Rowan reached the collapse in 12 seconds and assessed it in 5. The frame was resting against the wall at an angle that created an unstable compression. It wasn't going to fall further immediately, but any uncontrolled force applied to it could shift the angle and worsen Halden's situation. Direct lift was possible, but required specific leverage and controlled application. Halden looked up at her. Whatever he expected, it wasn't. This wasn't her specifically crossing into his lane and crouching beside his trapped legs, with the focused assessment of someone who has done this before in conditions that were considerably worse than a training village in Nevada. "How bad?" she asked. "Left leg. Something's wrong with the ankle." His voice was controlled the way trained people's voices are controlled when they're in pain and don't intend to show it. "I can feel my feet. I'm not paralyzed." "Good. Don't try to move." She was already studying the frame geometry. "The approach point for the lift is the lower left junction. If I get under the beam there and use my legs as the primary lever, I can raise it 4 to 6 inches. That's enough for Calderon to pull you clear. But I need you to not help me. If you push against the frame while I'm lifting, you'll shift the angle, and we both have a problem." Halden stared at her. "You can't lift that." "I know exactly what I can lift," she said. "Do you understand the instruction, 'Don't push against the frame'?" A beat. "Yes." "Calderon." She positioned herself at the lower junction, feet planted back against the ground, hands gripping the beam above her. "When I give you the word, you have 6 seconds to get him clear. 6 seconds only. After that, I'm going to have to let it down." Calderon was already in position beside Halden, hands under his shoulders. "Ready. Owen, as soon as he's clear, you assess the ankle and the left hip. Don't move him until you know what's broken." "Ready," Owen said. Rowan took 2 full breaths. Then she drove with her legs. The frame moved. It didn't move easily. It moved the way heavy things move when the right force is applied with the right technique, which is to say, slowly and with enormous physical cost. Inches that felt like feet, and a weight that felt like the entire building was resting in her hands. Her arms locked. Her legs drove. 3 inches. 4. "Now," she said. Calderon pulled. Halden came clear in one controlled motion. Calderon's grip under both arms, moving him backward along the ground, while Rowan held the frame. She counted in her head, 1, 2, 3, and when Calderon said clear, she let the beam down with control rather than dropping it, which mattered because dropping it would have sent a vibration through the unstable wall section above. She lay on the ground for exactly 4 seconds. Then she got up. Owen was already on Halden. "Ankle is fractured. Left hip is bruised, possibly cracked. I can't confirm without imaging. He shouldn't stand." Halden was looking at Rowan. The expression on his face was not one she'd seen from him before. It wasn't calculation, wasn't skepticism, wasn't the particular performance of confident dismissal. It was something rawer and less managed. Something closer to a man who has just had his assumptions removed by force and hasn't yet assembled a replacement. "You disqualified yourself," he said. "Yes," she said. "You knew that when you crossed the line." "Yes." "Why?" Rowan looked at him. The answer was simple, and she didn't dress it up. "Because you were trapped and I could help. That's the whole reason." Halden said nothing, and then the secondary collapse happened. It was the wall section that Rowan had been careful not to vibrate when she lowered the beam. The loose concrete had been resting in a precarious balance, and the structural disturbance of the initial frame failure had been working on it for 4 minutes. It came down in a section roughly 2 meters wide, and it came down across the vehicle approach route, the path the medical vehicle was using to reach Halden's position. The route was gone. The vehicle couldn't reach them. Owen looked at the blocked route, looked at Halden, looked at Rowan. Halden said to no one in particular, and everyone present, "Leave me, get the beacon, finish your run." Rowan was already assessing the evacuation options. "Ma'am." Owen's voice was quiet and careful. "We're already disqualified. If we leave him and finish the run, we've abandoned a casualty to complete a disqualified mission." "I know," Rowan said. She had found the alternative route, the final obstacle corridor, narrower, longer, more physically demanding, designed as the last challenge of the event rather than an evacuation path. It could work. It would work. It was going to be extremely hard. She looked at Halden. She thought about what he had said in the opening formation 5 days ago. She thought about every comment, every dismissal, every moment designed to make 500 soldiers see her as something less than what she was. Then she thought about what she had said to Owen 3 days ago on a Nevada ridge with a collapsed ravine below them. A record tells people what you survived. Your choices tell them who you are. She pulled the casualty harness from her kit. "What are you doing?" Halden said. "Securing you for transport." She moved to him efficiently. "This is going to be uncomfortable. You can't carry me through that corridor." "I can," she said, "and I'm going to." She looked at him directly. "Nobody under my command gets left behind, not even the man who doubted me." The words weren't delivered as a speech. They weren't theatrical. They came out the way true things come out, plainly, without decoration, with the particular weight of a statement that the speaker has already decided to prove. Halden said nothing. She got him into the harness. The obstacle corridor was 400 meters of the most demanding terrain in the training village, angled sections, a low crawl passage, a 4-foot step-up, and a final grade that inclined at approximately 15 degrees for the last 60 meters. It was designed to be completed unloaded or with a training dummy. Nobody had ever carried a conscious adult male through it in competition conditions. Rowan began at the entrance, and Owen walked beside her, one hand lightly on her arm, not to carry Halden's weight, but to stabilize her balance on the angled sections, which she had accepted without comment, because the mission mattered more than the optics of needing help. Calderon was in front, clearing the path, communicating obstacles back in the quiet shorthand they'd developed over 4 days of working together. "Low section in 12 feet, Calderon said. "Copy," Rowan said. Her arms were burning. She could feel it from the shoulder joints down through the forearms, a deep, specific burn that is different from the surface burn of effort, the kind that comes from load-bearing at the edge of your capacity. Her left knee had begun to send her signals she was choosing to receive and file rather than respond to. She kept her breathing measured, not the breathing of someone comfortable, but the breathing of someone who has decided that discomfort is not the deciding factor. Halden could feel her arms trembling. He was not a small man, 220 pounds of combat-maintained weight, plus the harness, plus the equipment on both of them. He could feel what this cost her. He could feel it in the small, involuntary shakes that ran through her frame every few steps, in the way her pace had shortened from its natural rhythm to something more deliberate and controlled. "Hale," he said. "Don't talk. It's not helping." "Put me down." "No. I'm giving you an order." "You are not my commanding officer, and you are not in a position to give orders," she said, and there was no anger in it, just fact delivered with the economy of someone conserving breath. "You are a casualty under my care. Let me work." The low crawl section was the worst part. She had to transition from an upright carry to a crouch drag, maintaining the harness connection while moving through a passage that required her to bend at the waist and nearly double over. Owen guided her through it, one hand on her shoulder blade, talking her through the geometry of the space, the way a spotter talks, a climber through a crux move. Calderon had gone ahead and was waiting at the exit, and when Rowan came through it with Halden secured. Calderon's expression was the expression of a man watching something he will not forget. The 4-foot step-up was where her knee buckled. Not collapsed, buckled. A single downward drop of 3 inches before she caught it, absorbed it, and drove through it. But the entire field saw it. The 500 soldiers who had moved to the corridor perimeter, who had gathered without being told to, drawn by the particular gravity of something real happening in a place designed for simulation. All 500 of them saw her knee go and saw her not go down. Nobody spoke. The grade was the last 60 meters, and it asked for everything she had left, which was less than she'd started with, and exactly enough. Her pace shortened further. Her breathing changed. The trembling in her arms was visible now, not embarrassing, not a sign of failure, but the visible evidence of what maximum effort actually looks like in a human body when it is honestly applied. Halden said her name, quietly this time. "Rowan." She didn't answer. "You don't have to do this." "Yes," she said between breaths, "I do." "Why?" She didn't have the breath to explain it fully. She gave him the short version, the version that fit inside the oxygen she had available. "Because you would have been left there." She took a step. "And nobody, another step, gets left. Another step. Not even you." Halden was quiet for the last 40 meters. The finish line was a painted bar across the corridor exit. Rowan reached it, stepped across it, and placed Halden down with the same controlled precision she had used on the 250 dummy in the opening formation 5 days ago. Not dropped, not fallen. Placed. She straightened. For one full second she didn't move, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the field. Then she looked up. 500 soldiers were standing in silence. The kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that sound would interrupt. Owen stood at the edge of the corridor exit. He looked at Rowan for a moment. Then he raised his hand to his brow and held a salute. Calderon beside him came to attention and saluted, one by one from Owen. Outward across the field, the movement spread. Not ordered, not coordinated, not performed. The organic salute of 500 people who had just watched something happen that they recognized not as a victory over a man, but as a demonstration of what the word they'd been trained around actually meant. Halden looked up from the ground. He looked at the 500 people standing at attention for a woman who had just carried him through an obstacle course rather than leave him behind. He looked at Rowan. He said nothing. Because there was nothing that didn't sound inadequate. Commander Araujo was standing at the gallery rail above the corridor exit, and she was writing notes with the focused attention of someone who understood that what they were documenting would matter later, not just for scoring, but for the report she was already beginning to compose in her mind, the one that would go upward through several layers of command and eventually reach people who made decisions about how exercises were designed, what they measured, and what standards actually looked like when they were honestly applied. She wrote 3 words and underlined them. "This is leadership." And below that one more line. Revise the evaluation criteria. The Crucible's final event had ended. The scoring was still being calculated. But in the field, in the silence that held 500 standing soldiers, the real verdict had already been delivered, not by a scoreboard, not by a panel of evaluators, but by the accumulated weight of 5 days of choices made by a woman who had decided before any of it began that what she did would speak louder and longer than anything anyone said about her. Grant Halden lay on the ground and stared at the Nevada sky, and felt for the first time in a very long time the particular humility of a man who has been thoroughly and completely wrong. Not about her strength, not about her record, about what strength was for. The medical team reached Halden 4 minutes after Rowan placed him down. I didn't resist them. He lay still and let them work, which was itself a change. The Grant Halden who had stepped out of formation 5 days ago would have been arguing with the medics about the severity of his own injury before they finished their first assessment. This version said nothing. He stared at the sky while Owen called the ankle fracture and the probable hip contusion, and directed the stretcher team with the calm authority of someone who had spent 4 days being reminded what he was actually capable of. Halden watched Owen work and said quietly enough that only the nearest medic heard it. "He's good." The medic glanced up. "Sir. Price. He's good." Halden said it like a man correcting a record he should have been keeping all along. Rowan was 20 feet away, sitting on a low barrier with her left leg extended, letting her knee recover from what she'd asked of it. She wasn't performing recovery. She wasn't making a show of the pain or minimizing it. She was simply managing it the way she managed most things, directly and without theater. Calderon crouched beside her with a water bottle and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. The 500 soldiers were still on the field. Nobody had been dismissed. Colonel Pemberton stood at the gallery rail and watched the scene below him with the expression of a man assembling a very careful response to something he hadn't anticipated. Beside him, Commander Araujo had stopped writing and was simply watching. The silence on that field had changed quality. It wasn't the shocked silence of the moment Rowan crossed the finish line. It had settled into something slower and heavier. The silence of 500 people individually processing the same event and arriving by different roads at similar conclusions. Then Halden's voice cut through it from the stretcher. "I need to speak," he said. Not loudly, but in the particular carrying tone of a man accustomed to being heard across distance. "Before they take me anywhere, I need to speak." Pemberton looked at Araujo. Araujo gave him nothing. Her expression said, "This is your field colonel." Pemberton's voice came over the field PA. Nothing. Her expression said, "This is your field colonel." Pemberton's voice came over the field PA. "Major Halden has the floor." The stretcher team raised him to a sitting position. His left ankle was immobilized. His face was the particular pale of someone managing significant pain, and he had the look of a man who has decided to do something that will cost him and has decided to pay it anyway. He looked across the field. 500 faces. Some of them had laughed with him 5 days ago. Most of them had watched the scoreboard shift away from him across 4 days of events. All of them had just watched a woman carry him through an obstacle corridor rather than leave him behind. He found Rowan. She hadn't moved from the barrier. She was watching him with the steady attention she applied to everything, not wary, not expectant, simply present. Halden spoke. 5 days ago I stood in this formation and told you that the Navy sent us a headline instead of an operator. He paused. The field was completely silent. I said it loud enough for all of you to hear. I meant for all of you to hear it. I wanted you to see her the way I saw her, as something that didn't belong in a serious exercise brought here for reasons that had nothing to do with actual capability. Another pause. His jaw was tight, not with anger, with the effort of saying true things that are uncomfortable to say. I was wrong about every part of that. Not slightly wrong. Completely wrong in ways that I'm still working out the full dimensions of. He looked at the soldiers nearest him, then at the ones further back. But the part I need to own publicly in front of the same people who heard me say, "It is this my rank and my reputation gave your doubt permission to become public." When I said it, some of you believed it because I said it. That's on me. Not on you. On me. Someone in the formation shifted. The movement spread slightly like a small current passing through water. Lieutenant Hale outscored me in every decision-weighted event in this crucible. She made calls in this field that I would not have made, and every one of them was right. When I was trapped under that frame, she crossed a line that disqualified her team to help me. She knew the rule. She crossed anyway. He stopped. And then she carried me because the alternative was leaving me behind, and that was not something she was willing to do. He looked directly at Rowan. I told the field you were a headline. You answered me with 5 days of work. I asked whether you'd ever carried a wounded teammate under real conditions. His voice dropped a register. You answered that question too, with me on your back. The field held its silence for 3 full seconds. Then Halden said, I'm requesting that my overall score be withdrawn from the final standings. Not as punishment, as accuracy. The record of this crucible should reflect what actually happened here, without my score inflating a competition I didn't win. That produced a sound from the formation, not applause, not protest, but the collective exhale of 500 people who had not expected that particular sentence. Commander Araujo wrote 3 words in her notebook, then crossed them out and wrote 2 different ones. Colonel Pemberton said nothing from the gallery rail. He was looking at Rowan. Rowan stood up from the barrier. Her left knee took the weight without giving way. She had assessed it correctly, manageable rather than serious. She walked the 20 feet to Halden's stretcher and stood in front of him and looked at him for a moment with an expression that was neither triumphant nor particularly forgiving, because neither of those was what the moment required. I don't need your score withdrawn, she said. Halden looked at her. I need you to mean what you just said when I'm not standing in front of you. She held his eyes. An apology in front of 500 people is a performance. What it becomes in the months after this, when you're back at your unit, when there's a female candidate in your pipeline, when your instinct is to write her off before she opens her mouth, that's where the apology lives or dies. She paused. Can you do that? Halden was quiet for 4 seconds. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm going to try." It was the most honest thing he'd said in 5 days, and both of them understood that. "Then try," Rowan said. She stepped back. "And keep your score in the standings. The record should show exactly what happened, including the parts where you were wrong." She walked back to the barrier. Calderon handed her the water bottle without comment. Owen across the field watched her sit down and then looked at the sky for a moment with the expression of someone storing a memory carefully. The evaluation board convened at 1400 hours in the Crucible's main assessment facility. Pemberton chaired. Araujo presented the final scoring and her annotated field notes. 3 other senior evaluators filled the remaining seats. The question on the table was one that no Crucible evaluation board had faced before: how to score an event in which a competitor voluntarily disqualified her team to prevent a genuine casualty, and subsequently demonstrated operational leadership that exceeded the parameters the event had been designed to measure. The standard rule was clear. Cross into another team's lane, your run ends. Rowan's team had crossed. Her run had ended. What was less clear was whether the event's design had accounted for the possibility of a real emergency, and whether a competitor's correct identification of a genuine crisis and correct response to it should be scored as a disqualification, or as exactly the kind of adaptive judgment the Crucible's decision-weighted events were attempting to measure. Araujo put it to the board plainly. The scenario introduction on day 1 told every competitor that the Crucible would test what they do when the mission in front of them becomes a different mission than the one they planned for. She set her notebook on the table. The mission in front of Lieutenant Hale became a different mission. She identified the change, made a real-time command decision that prioritized life over score, and executed the response with the kind of physical and tactical competence that this exercise exists to evaluate. She looked around the table. If we score that as a disqualification, we are telling every person in this field that we designed a test for leadership and then penalized the most significant act of leadership it produced. The board was quiet. One evaluator, an Army colonel named Greer, said, "The rule exists for competitive integrity. If we waive it here, what stops the next competitor from claiming a genuine emergency every time they're losing ground? Nothing," Araujo said. "And that's why the record has to be precise about what this was. The frame failure was real, documented, and is currently the subject of a facility maintenance inquiry. The casualty was real. The root blockage was real. Lieutenant Hale did not claim an emergency. She responded to one." She paused. "The rule is a good rule for the situation it was designed for. This was not that situation." Greer looked at Pemberton. "Your call, Colonel." Pemberton had been quiet through the entire presentation. He looked at his notes for a long moment. Then he looked at Araujo. "What's your recommendation?" "Score her team's performance from the point of the real emergency forward as a separate evaluation category. Adaptive response under genuine crisis conditions. Full credit for the decision to cross the structural extraction the casualty carry, and the route navigation under compromised conditions." Araujo set her pen down. "And then use this case to rewrite the evaluation criteria before next year's Crucible." Pemberton looked at each evaluator in turn. Nobody objected. "Done," he said. "Chate." The formal results posting happened at 1700 hours, assembled formation, all 500. Pemberton read the scores without preamble. Rowan's team first across every meaningful metric. Halden's team third, not because he had underperformed across the week, but because the weight of the final event's scoring had shifted the combined standing in ways his day 1 lead couldn't absorb. Then Pemberton said something that was not in the standard results protocol. "The evaluation board has voted unanimously to create a new scoring category, effective immediately retroactive to this Crucible's final event. Adaptive response, under genuine emergency conditions. Lieutenant Hale's team has been awarded full marks in this category, which the board has weighted at 40% of the final event score." He paused. "This is not a rule change designed to benefit a specific competitor. It is a rule change that corrects an oversight in the original design, the failure to account for what happens when this exercise produces a real-world situation rather than a simulated one. He looked out across the formation. This crucible was designed to find people who perform correctly when the stakes are real. Today, the stakes were real. The record will reflect that. He folded the paper. Lieutenant Hale is the overall winner of the Joint Warrior Crucible. The field responded not with the polished, coordinated response of a formal ceremony, but with the particular noise of 500 people who have been holding something and are releasing it. Loud, genuine, slightly disorganized the way real things are. Owen was making a sound that he would later describe to anyone who asked as controlled enthusiasm, and which Calderon would accurately describe as something much closer to a yell. Calderon himself stood at attention with the expression of a man who had decided 4 days ago that this outcome was correct and was now receiving confirmation. Rowan stood in formation and received it. She didn't smile with the broad performance of victory. She smiled with the particular quiet expression of someone who ran a very long race and has finally been permitted to stop running. Across the field, in the medical observation area, where he'd been watching the posting on a tablet, Halden heard the result and set the tablet down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at his ankle immobilized and elevated and thought about the 23 points he'd needed and the 60 meters of corridor she'd covered with him on her back. He thought about what she'd said. Not the version for the 500. The version for him standing 2 feet away, with her knee recovering and her arm still shaking from the effort. Nobody gets left. Not even you. I thought about the years he'd spent building a definition of strength that fit exactly the dimensions of his own body and his own experience. He thought about how confident he'd been in that definition. He thought about how completely and specifically it had failed to account for her. His phone had 17 messages. Most of them were from people in his training unit, Rangers instructors, men he'd worked alongside for years. He read the first 3 and put the phone face down. The 4th message was from his commanding officer. It said, "We saw the field footage. Come talk to me when you're back." Not a debrief. A conversation. Halden looked at that message for a long time. Then he looked at the tablet screen where the results were still displayed and at the name at the top of the standings. He picked up his phone and opened a new message. He typed a name, Saunders, and then sat for a moment thinking about what to say. What he wanted to say was something that resolved it cleanly, that closed the distance between who he had been at Yo 5:30 on Monday and who he needed to be going forward. But clean resolutions were the property of men who hadn't spent 5 days being wrong in front of 500 witnesses. He typed, "I have some work to do. I think it starts with my own unit." Saunders replied in 40 seconds. "Yes, it does. I'll be there." Halden put the phone down. Outside the medical facility, he could hear the field, the noise of 500 people who had watched something real happen and were still processing it, still talking, still carrying the weight of what they'd seen into conversations they would have for years. He thought about what Rowan had said about apologies. How they live or die not in the moment of delivery, but in the 1,000 small moments that come after, when no one is watching and nothing is scored, and the only audience is the person you're becoming. He had spent 5 days being watched. Now the real work started. He looked at his ankle. He looked at his phone. He looked at the ceiling. He had a lot of work to do, and for the first time in a very long time, Grant Halden was not certain he knew exactly how to do it, which meant for the first time in a very long time, he was in a position to actually learn. The footage reached the internet before Halden reached the hospital. Someone in the field. Nobody ever confirmed who had captured the last 4 minutes of the obstacle corridor on a personal device. Not the full event, not the structural collapse, just the final section. Rowan's arms trembling, her knee buckling and recovering her pace. Shortening to something that looked like pure will, applied to a body that had already given everything it had. And Halden on her back, silent, watching the finish line approach from a position he had never in 37 years of military service occupied before. 48 hours after the crucible ended, the clip had been viewed 11 million times. By the end of the week, it was 34 million. The comments were what comments always are, a mixture of the genuine and the performative. The people who understood what they were seeing, and the people who were reacting to a surface impression of it. But underneath the noise, something was moving through the military community, specifically through the networks of people who had served, who understood what the crucible was and what it measured, who could read the physical language of what Rowan was doing in that corridor and understand its precise cost. Former operators were sharing it with a single line of text. Active duty instructors were showing it in training units without comment, letting it speak. A retired SEAL Master Chief posted a 4-sentence response that got more engagement than the original clip I've been in: water cold enough to kill you with 2 wounded men and no boat. I know what it costs to keep moving when your body is telling you to stop. I know what it means to make the decision to keep going anyway. That's what you're watching. Rowan knew none of this for the first 18 hours because she was in a Navy medical facility having her knee properly assessed, a grade 2 strain of the medial collateral ligament, manageable, requiring 2 weeks of structured rest and 4 to 6 weeks of graduated return to full activity. The doctor who delivered this assessment was a lieutenant commander named Voss, who had the particular manner of military physicians who have seen enough self-inflicted injury to be perpetually unsurprised by it. You completed a 400-meter loaded carry on this, Voss said, looking at the imaging results. I completed the last 60 meters on it, Rowan said. That distinction is not as meaningful as you think it is. He looked up from the results. How long were you aware it was compromised? About halfway through the corridor. And you continued. There wasn't an alternative that I was willing to accept, she said. Voss looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the imaging. 2 weeks non-weight bearing on uneven terrain. 4 weeks before any operational load-bearing activity. These are not suggestions. Understood. Lieutenant. He set the imaging down. I've seen the footage. She said nothing. 11 million people have seen the footage. He paused. I want you to understand that what you did in that corridor, medically speaking, was not without real risk. The MCL strain you're sitting with could have been a complete tear. On that terrain with that load, a complete tear means you go down. You go down, the casualty goes down with you, and the situation gets significantly worse. I assessed the probability, Rowan said. And I decided the alternative was worse than the risk. Voss was quiet for a moment. What was the alternative? She looked at him steadily. Leaving him. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he wrote something in her file, closed it, and said, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, those are the numbers. He stood. I'll have the nurse bring the RAP protocol. He was at the door when he stopped, didn't turn around. For what it's worth, he said, I think you made the right call. He left before she could respond, which was probably intentional. Owen found out about the video from his sister, who texted him a link at 0600 the morning after the crucible ended with the message, "Is this you?" in the background. He was in the link before he finished reading the text. He watched the clip twice. Then he sat on the edge of his bunk and looked at his hands for a long time. He had been there. He had walked beside her through that corridor, one hand on her arm for balance on the angled sections, calling obstacles to Calderon in the shorthand they'd built over 5 days. He had watched her knee go and watched her not go down. He had been close enough to hear her breathing the specific controlled rhythm of someone who has made a decision that their body is no longer the deciding factor. He had watched all of it happen in real time and understood what it was. But seeing it from the outside, the way 11 million other people were seeing it from a distance that turned it into something larger and more legible, produced a different understanding. The kind that settles into your chest rather than your head. He called his mother. She picked up on the second ring. I saw the video, she said before he could speak. I was there, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? Yes. He thought about it. I think I'm better than okay. I think I'm... He stopped. Started again. Mom, I came here thinking the best thing that could happen to me was to be seen next to the right people. I spent 2 years thinking that's how you build a career. You position yourself. You perform where people are watching. He paused. She didn't do any of that. She just made the right call every time in front of whoever was there to see it, or nobody at all. And by the end, everyone was there to see it, his mother said after a pause. Is she someone you'd want to work with again? Yes, Owen said without hesitation. She's the kind of person that makes you want to be better at your job. Not to impress her, because she reminds you why the job matters. He hung up and looked at the link again. 34 million views, the counter now said. I thought about what Rowan had told him on the ridge 3 days into the Crucible after the ravine collapse. The fact that I can't tell you doesn't change what it means. It happened. I learned from it. That's enough. I understood it differently now. All of it, the classified record, the sealed commendations, the cold water extraction that Briggs had described in a logistics room 2 days before the world learned what she was capable of in a different corridor on different terrain. It had always been enough. The Crucible had simply created conditions where what was always true became visible. He opened his laptop and began researching special operations medical selection programs. Not to position himself, not to be seen in the right place, because the job mattered. Halden's conversation with his commanding officer happened on a Thursday, 8 days after the Crucible ended. His ankle was in a walking boot. He sat across from Brigadier General Marcus Webb in an office that had the particular quiet of a room where serious things are regularly said, and he told the truth without dressing it up. He told Webb about the opening formation, the laugh, the words he'd chosen, and the volume he'd chosen to deliver them at. He told him about the mess hall comments on days 2 and 3, the claims about her record, the suggestions about evaluator favoritism. He told it all in the flat sequential manner of a formal report, because that was the only way he knew to deliver information he was ashamed of. Webb listened without interrupting. He had seen the footage, everyone had seen the footage, and he had read Araujo's evaluation report, which had been distributed to senior command 3 days after the Crucible ended, and which was now being discussed at levels of the Department of Defense that neither Halden nor Rowan had direct access to. When Halden finished, Webb said, "What do you want from this conversation?" Halden looked at him. "Guidance, accountability, whatever you think is appropriate." "I'll tell you what I think is appropriate." Webb leaned forward. "I think what happened in that field has already produced the most significant public accountability moment of your career. I think 500 soldiers watched you get carried out of a training scenario by a woman you tried to publicly discredit, and I think that's going to follow your record whether I do anything about it or not." Halden said nothing. "What I'm more interested in," Webb continued, "is what you do with your unit. Not the public record, the day-to-day work, the pipeline you run, the candidates who come through your program." He paused. "How many female candidates have you assessed in the last 2 years?" Halden thought. 6. "How many passed your assessment?" A longer pause. 1. Webb let that number sit in the room for a moment. Is that because 5 of them weren't qualified? It was the question Halden had been turning over for 8 days in the medical facility and the barracks and the long sleepless spaces between. He had constructed several answers and discarded all of them because none of them were fully honest. And he had decided in the medical facility, listening to Rowan's voice in his head saying, "An apology matters only if it changes what you do when I'm not present," that partial honesty was the same as none. "I don't know," he said. "And that's the problem." Webb studied him. "Explain that." "I don't know whether I assessed them against the standard or against my idea of the standard. I don't know whether I was measuring their performance or measuring the distance between their performance and the image I had in my head of what performance looks like." He stopped. Rowan Hale scored top marks in every decision-weighted event in the Joint Warrior Crucible. If she had come through my pipeline before this week, I might have found a way to score her out. The words cost him something real. He could feel the cost while he was paying it. Webb was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want to do about it?" "Reopen the assessments," Halden said. "The 5 who didn't pass. I want to look at the documentation and determine whether the scoring reflects the standard or reflects me." He paused. "And I want someone else in the room when I do it. Someone who will tell me when I'm doing it wrong." Webb nodded slowly. "I can arrange that. I also want to make the change to how I run the opening assessment." Halden looked at his hands for a moment, then back at Webb. "Currently, I introduce the program in a way that emphasizes legacy and lineage, who came before, what they looked like, what they achieved. It's designed to motivate through tradition. He paused. I think it filters. I think it tells candidates who don't fit the historical image that this program isn't for them before they've done a single evolution. Webb said nothing. I want to change the introduction, Halden said. I want to start with the standard and nothing else. What we measure, how we measure it, what passing looks like in terms of performance, not appearance. Webb leaned back in his chair and looked at Halden with the expression of a man revising an assessment. Not dramatically subtly the way real revisions happen, one piece of evidence at a time. Write me a proposal, he said. Specific changes, implementation timeline, measurable outcomes. He paused. And Grant, if you write it, you own it. I'm not going to protect you if the implementation goes poorly because you didn't follow through. I know, Halden said. Good. Webb stood, which was the signal the conversation was ending. One more thing. Halden looked up. Rowan Hale's evaluation report is going to 3 different committees at the DoD level. There's a discussion happening about the Crucible's assessment criteria and whether it accurately measures the full spectrum of operational leadership. Webb held his gaze. Someone at that level is going to want her testimony, and someone is also going to want yours. He paused. What you say in that room is going to matter to a lot of people who never saw the field. Halden stood boot and all. I'll say exactly what I said in front of 500 soldiers. Webb looked at him for a moment. Then say it clearly, he said, and say it first. Saunders was waiting outside Webb's office. He fell into step beside Halden without asking how it went, because he could read it from the way Halden moved, not lighter exactly, but more settled, the way a man moves when he has said a difficult thing and survived the saying of it. They walked for half a block before Halden said, he wants a proposal, program changes, assessment reform. Are you going to write it? Already started it in my head, Saunders nodded. They walked another half block. The 5 candidates. I know. You want me there when you review them? Halden looked at him. I asked Webb for someone who would tell me when I'm doing it wrong. And you're the person who told me I had a problem before I was willing to hear it. Halden held his gaze. You're the right person to be in the room. Saunders said nothing for a moment. Then, okay. They kept walking. The boot made Halden's gait uneven, and he hadn't yet fully adjusted to it, and there was something almost appropriate about that. A man who had spent 37 years moving with perfect physical confidence, now navigating the world, slightly off balance, learning to account for a new variable. Derek, Halden said. Saunders looked at him. She told me the apology lives or dies in what I do when she's not there. He paused. She's not going to be there for any of this. No, Saunders said. That's the point, isn't it? Yeah, Saunders said. That's the point. Calderon got back to his unit on a Friday and said almost nothing about the Crucible for the first 4 days. His Marines asked because the footage was everywhere, and they knew he'd been there, and he told them he'd been on Rowan's team, and left it at that. On the 5th day, a lance corporal in his unit named Ferris came to him after a training evolution and said, Staff Sergeant, the woman in the video, what's she actually like? Calderon looked at Ferris for a moment. Ferris was 22 years old and had been in the unit 8 months and was trying visibly and imperfectly to figure out what kind of Marine he was going to be. She notices people, Calderon said. Ferris waited for more. Most leaders see a formation, Calderon said. She sees individuals. She figures out what each one is actually capable of, and then she builds the mission around that, instead of building the mission and asking people to fit into it. He paused. She told me once that rank is for organizational structure. Events have their own architecture. You put the right person in the right role based on what the situation requires, not based on who's senior. Ferris was quiet for a moment. Is that why she gave the triage lead to the Army medic? You watched the evaluation report. It got posted online. Commander Araujo's field notes. Calderon nodded slowly. Yes, that's why. He looked at Ferris. Owen Price knew more about that specific situation than anyone else on the team. She knew it before the event started. So she gave him the lead, and then she got out of his way and let him do the job. He paused. You know how rare that is, a team leader who gets out of their own way when someone else is the right person for the moment. Ferris said, I want to be that kind of leader. Calderon looked at him for a long moment. Then start noticing people, he said. Not performances. People. There's a difference, and it takes practice. Ferris nodded and walked away, and Calderon watched him go, and thought about what it had taken. 1 woman, 5 days, a collapsed frame, and 60 meters of obstacle corridor to produce a conversation like this one in a Marine unit that would never see the Crucible field. That was the thing about what Rowan had done. It didn't stay in Nevada. It traveled the way real things travel through the people who had witnessed it, and then through the people those people talked to, and then further still in widening circles into conversations happening in units and facilities and medical programs and ranger pipelines that had no direct connection to the Joint Warrior Crucible at all. Rowan herself was largely unaware of most of this. She was 2 weeks into her recovery protocol, working through the structured rest that Voss had prescribed with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and she was using the time to do something she hadn't had space for in the months leading up to the Crucible. She was thinking about what came next. Not for her career. For the exercise. She had a yellow legal pad on the table beside her, and it was covered in notes that were less a formal proposal and more a running argument with the Crucible's existing design, page after page of observations about what the exercise measured and what it missed, what the scoring weighted, and why those weights produced the outcomes they did. What a genuinely comprehensive assessment of operational leadership would need to include to accurately identify the full range of capability it was ostensibly looking for. She had 14 pages of notes and a question at the top of page 1 that she hadn't answered yet. The question was, what does strength actually look like when the stakes are real? She'd been thinking about that question since the first morning when Halden had pointed at her and the field had laughed. She'd been carrying it through 5 days of events and 1 structural collapse and 60 meters of corridor and a knee injury and 11 million views and a DoD committee that was now apparently interested in what she had to say. She picked up the pen. She looked at the question. Then she turned to page 15 and began to write the answer. The DoD committee convened on a Tuesday morning in a conference room in Arlington, Virginia, 6 weeks after the Crucible ended. Rowan arrived first. She always arrived first. It was a habit so deeply embedded it had stopped being a decision and become simply what she did. She was walking without the brace. Now the MCL strain resolved to the point where Voss had cleared her for light operational activity, with the particular reluctance of a physician who knows his patient will interpret clearance as permission to do significantly more than the word light implies. She sat at the table and looked at the empty chairs and thought about the yellow legal pad. 14 pages of notes had become a 37-page formal proposal over the course of 6 weeks, and the proposal had been submitted to the committee 10 days before this meeting, and she had received exactly 1 response to it, a single line from an admiral named Crane, who chaired the committee, which said, "We have read it carefully. We have questions." She had spent 10 days wondering which questions. The room filled gradually. Admiral Crane, 3 generals from different branches, 2 civilian policy analysts from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Commander Araujo, whose field notes had apparently become required reading at this level. And at the far end of the table in a chair, he had no doubt requested specifically Grant Halden. Walking boot replaced by a standard shoe. Now the ankle healed to the point of full weight bearing his face, carrying the particular quality of a man who has spent 6 weeks doing difficult internal work and is not yet certain it shows. He met Rowan's eyes across the table when he sat down. She nodded once. He nodded back. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was something more honest than warmth. The acknowledgement between 2 people who have been through something real together and are still working out what it means. Admiral Crane opened without preamble. Lieutenant Hale, your proposal recommends restructuring the Joint Warrior Crucible's assessment framework across 4 primary categories. Before we discuss the specifics, I want to ask you one question, and I want a direct answer. He looked at her steadily. Is this proposal about improving the exercise, or is it about what happened to you at the exercise? The room held its breath. Rowan said both. And I think that's the honest answer, which is more useful to this committee than a cleaner one. Crane studied her. Explain that. What happened to me at the exercise was a direct result of a gap in the exercise's design. The Crucible measures speed, raw strength, and tactical execution. It measures them well. What it doesn't measure, or didn't before Commander Araujo's proposed category addition, is adaptive judgment under genuine pressure, leadership behavior, when the mission changes, and the ability to prioritize correctly, when the correct priority costs you something. She paused. Those gaps allowed a competitor with a strong record in the measured categories to publicly dismiss a competitor whose strengths fell primarily in the unmeasured ones. And the field believed him because the scoreboard hadn't yet told them a different story. The room was quiet. The proposal isn't about what happened to me, she continued. It's about what the Crucible is supposed to find. If the answer is the best all-around operator in the joint service community, then the assessment should measure all-around capability, not a selection of it that happens to favor one physical archetype. She looked at Crane directly. If this committee is satisfied with the current design, that's a legitimate position. But then the Crucible should be honest about what it's actually selecting for. One of the generals, a Marine named Holloway, said, "What it's selecting for right now isn't wrong. Speed matters. Strength matters. Physical dominance in a combat scenario matters." "Yes," Rowan said. "I carried 220 pounds of combat-maintained weight through 400 meters of obstacle terrain on a compromised knee. I'm not arguing that physical capacity doesn't matter." She held Holloway's gaze. "I'm arguing that physical capacity without adaptive judgment is a liability, not an asset, and that the current design rewards the first without adequately testing the second." Holloway looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up her proposal and turned to page 12. "The section on decision-weighted events. You're proposing increasing the weight from 30 to 55% of the combined score." "Yes." "That's a significant shift." "It's a shift that reflects what actually decides outcomes in complex operational environments," Rowan said. "Not a theoretical position, an evidence-based one." Crane looked at Araujo. "Commander, your assessment of the proposal's operational validity." Araujo opened her own copy. "The framework is sound. The weight adjustments are aggressive but defensible based on the performance data from the last 3 Crucible cycles, which I've analyzed in the appendix." She turned to the appendix. In every cycle, the competitors who performed best in real-world follow-on assignments were those who scored highest in decision quality, not those who scored highest in speed and strength metrics. She set the document down. "The current scoring rewards the candidates who look most like the exercise's original designers imagined an elite operator would look. The proposed scoring rewards the candidates who actually perform best." The civilian analyst to Crane's left, a woman named Park, who had been silent until this moment, said, "Major Halden, you submitted a written statement to this committee in advance of this meeting. I'd like you to speak to it directly." Halden straightened in his chair. "Yes, ma'am. Your statement supports the proposal's core framework. That's a significant position for an officer with your record and your previous public statements about this exercise." She looked at him without judgment, simply with the precision of someone whose job is to understand the full picture. "What changed?" Halden was quiet for 3 seconds. The room waited. "I did," he said. Park waited. "I came to that exercise with 37 years of a definition of what strength looks like. I built that definition from my own body, my own record, my own experience. And because I'd been right about a lot of things for a long time, I stopped checking whether the definition was complete." He paused. "It wasn't complete. It left out everything that Lieutenant Hale is actually made of. And because my definition didn't account for it, I decided it didn't exist." He looked at the proposal in front of him. "She didn't argue with me. She didn't ask me to update my definition. She just kept making correct decisions in front of people who were watching until the scoreboard made the argument for her." Another pause. "And then when I was trapped under a steel frame and my definition of strength had left me exactly 0 options, she crossed a lane boundary and lifted the beam and carried me to the finish line." He looked up. "That's not a metaphor. That literally happened, and it told me everything I needed to know about whether my definition was right." The room was quiet for a long moment. Crane said to no one specifically, I think we have what we need. He looked at Rowan. We'll have a response to the proposal within 30 days. I want you to know that the discussion in this room is not the first discussion we've had about the Crucible's design. It is, however, the first one that came with this level of evidence. He closed the proposal. You'll be hearing from us, Lieutenant. She nodded. She looked at Halden across the table. He looked back. Neither of them said anything in the room. But in the elevator afterward, waiting for the doors to close, Halden said quietly, "The 5 candidates." Rowan looked at him. "From my pipeline, the 5 who didn't pass my assessment before the Crucible." He kept his voice level. "I went back through the scoring documentation with Saunders and someone Webb assigned from outside the unit. It took 3 weeks." He paused. 2 of them were scored correctly against the standard. They genuinely didn't meet the performance threshold. Rowan waited. 3 of them were scored against my version of the standard, he said. Not the written one, mine. His jaw tightened. I've requested that their assessments be reopened under a blind review process. I won't be in the room. The elevator doors opened. Neither of them moved for a moment. That's the right call, Rowan said. I know. He looked at the open doors. It doesn't feel good. It's not supposed to feel good, she said. It's supposed to be right. He nodded once. Then he walked out of the elevator, and she let the doors close and she rode back down alone with the particular quiet of someone who has just watched a man take a step that cost him something real. Owen's acceptance letter to the Special Operations Combat Medic Program arrived on a Wednesday, 7 weeks after the Crucible ended. He called Rowan before he called his mother. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Price. I got in, he said. A pause. Then, good. That's all good. What else do you want? He laughed a short, genuine sound. I don't know. Something a little more... Owen. Her voice was warm but direct. You got in because you're ready. Not because of the Crucible. Not because of me. Because of 2 years of combat medical support, and 1 week of performing at the level you're actually capable of when someone points you at it. She paused. You were always going to get here. You just needed someone to stop standing between you and where you were headed. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't stand between anything. You just got out of the way. That's what I said. He smiled. Thank you for the triage lead, for treating me like I was already the version of myself I was trying to become. She said, you were already that version. You just hadn't been told yet. He hung up and sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. He thought about the ravine, the triage event, the command simulation where she had handed him real authority and then trusted him to use it correctly. He thought about what Calderon had said to Ferris, start noticing people, not performances. He thought about how different those 2 things were and how long it had taken him to understand the difference. He put the letter on the desk. He pulled up the Special Operations Combat Medic Program curriculum and began to read it with the focused attention of someone who has stopped positioning himself and started preparing. Calderon's certification came 2 months after the Crucible, and it arrived with a posting that he hadn't applied for and didn't expect. The Joint Warrior Crucible had formally adopted Commander Araujo's proposed evaluation category, Adaptive Response, under genuine emergency conditions as a permanent component of its assessment framework. The committee had also approved a modified version of Rowan's proposal, with the decision weight percentage adjusted to 48% from her proposed 55%, a compromise that Araujo had described in her recommendation as operationally sound and politically realistic. The first Crucible under the new framework was scheduled for the following year, and the committee had approved a new position, Lead Integration Instructor, responsible for training the evaluators who would assess the new categories, certifying that their own understanding of adaptive judgment and leadership under pressure was deep enough to recognize it accurately in candidates. The posting went to Calderon. He read it twice. Then he called Rowan. They're offering me the Lead Integration Instructor position for the new framework, he said. I know, she said. I recommended you. He was quiet for a moment. You recommended me. You noticed things that other people missed across 5 days in a high-pressure environment. You adapted your assessment of me in real time as the evidence changed instead of protecting the conclusion you started with. And you got out of your own way during the command simulation when Owen needed the space. She paused. Those are the exact skills the evaluators need. I knew it before the Crucible ended. Calderon sat with that for a moment. You were thinking about the framework during the Crucible. I was thinking about it from day 2, she said. When the ravine collapsed and I realized the exercise wasn't designed to credit the decision that prevented it, I started noting the gaps then. He shook his head slowly. 3 moves ahead, he said. Halden said it on day 4. He was right. I was right about a lot of things by day 4, she said. Just not the ones that mattered on day 1. Calderon accepted the posting. He reported to his new assignment on a Monday morning and spent the first week reviewing the existing evaluator training program with the focused dissatisfaction of someone who has been shown what excellent looks like and is now being asked to look at adequate. He rewrote the evaluator training curriculum from the first module. He submitted the revised version to Araujo, who read it in a single sitting and sent back one line. This is exactly what we needed. When does the first cohort start? He set the start date for 6 weeks out and began building the cohort roster with the same principle Rowan had applied to her teams, the right person for the right role, based on what the situation requires, not based on who is senior. The first Crucible under the new framework ran 12 months after the original. Rowan arrived at Camp Granite Ridge on a Sunday evening the day before it began. Her title for this Crucible was Senior Observer, a role that carried no competitive stakes and full access to every event, every evaluation, every scoring decision. She was there to watch the new framework function in real conditions and to note what the revision had gotten right and what it hadn't yet accounted for. She walked the field that Sunday evening alone, in the particular quiet of a place that hasn't yet filled with the people who will give it its specific energy. The training village where the steel frame had come down was repaired and reinforced. The maintenance report had been acted on with the thoroughness that tends to follow a real accident in a high-profile environment. She walked past the obstacle corridor and didn't stop to look at it. She had made her peace with that corridor in the first 2 weeks of recovery when she'd had nothing but time and a yellow legal pad and the slow grinding work of turning experience into something useful. She was standing at the edge of the staging area, going through the next day's event schedule in her head when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Halden. How was in civilian clothes? This was his weekend. Not a duty day, and he had driven 4 hours from his unit to be here before the Crucible began. His ankle showed no remaining sign of the injury. He moved the way he had always moved with the ease of a large man, comfortable in his own physicality, except that something in the overall quality of it had changed. Something less performed. Something more honest. You're early, Rowan said. I wanted to see the field before it started, he said. I thought you might be here. She looked at him. How's the pipeline? Different, he said. Better. Slower in some ways. We're spending more time on the assessment process, more time documenting the scoring rationale, more time making sure we know the difference between the written standard and our idea of it. He paused. The blind review came back on the 3 candidates. She waited. 2 of them have been invited to reassess, he said. The third, her performance documentation under the blind review, still showed a genuine gap in one critical category. Not my version of the standard. The actual standard. He looked at her steadily. I want you to know I checked that 3 times. With Saunders, with the external reviewer, and with Webb. I believe you, she said. I needed you to know I checked. I know why, she said. And I appreciate it. They stood in the quiet of the empty field for a moment. The Nevada sky was doing what Nevada skies do in the evening, producing colors that seem too large and too committed to be real, spread across a horizon that has no buildings to interrupt it. The 2 candidates who are reassessing, Rowan said. When next month? He paused. I've asked Saunders to run the assessment, not me. She looked at him. I'll be there as an observer, he said. I'll write my own independent assessment after, but Saunders runs it. My scoring doesn't count. He met her eyes. It was his idea, actually. He said if I'm serious about recalibrating the best way to test. The recalibration is to take myself out of the equation and see whether my independent assessment matches the blind result. Rowan said, "That's a good idea." "He has them sometimes," Halden said. "I don't tell him often enough." She almost smiled. "Tell him." A pause. "I will." The quiet between them had changed quality. It wasn't the charged silence of two competitors who hadn't yet resolved their accounting. It was something quieter and more complicated, the silence of people who have been through something real together and are still slowly working out what the aftermath looks like. "What are you watching for tomorrow?" he asked. "In the new framework." She thought about it honestly. Whether the evaluators can tell the difference between a candidate who is making correct decisions and a candidate who is making confident decisions. Those two things look very similar in the early events. By day 3, you can usually tell them apart if you know what you're looking for. She paused. "I want to see whether Calderon's training produced evaluators who know what they're looking for." Halden nodded slowly. "And if it didn't, then I write it down and we fix the training," she said. "That's how frameworks improve. You run them, you watch what they miss, you correct." He was quiet for a moment. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," she said. "It's just not complicated in the ways that stop people from doing it. The complicated part is being willing to look honestly at what you find." She looked at him. "Which is the same thing as everything else." He held her gaze. And then he said something he hadn't planned to say, something that came out of the 6-week quiet of recovery and 3 weeks of blind review documentation and 4 hours of highway driving, and the particular honesty that empty fields produce in people who are trying to be better than they were. "I've thought about what you said, about the apology, living or dying, and what I do when you're not present." He paused. "You haven't been present for most of the last 3 months. The pipeline work, the reassessments, the proposal, support the conversations with Webb." He looked at the field. "I wanted you to know that the work happened anyway, not because anyone was watching, not because it would reach you, because it needed to happen." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "Saunders told Araujo," she said. "Araujo is on my committee, I heard." She met his eyes. "I wasn't going to tell you I knew, but you just told me you did it without an audience, which means you earned the right to know it, reached one anyway." Something moved across Halden's face. Not relief exactly, but the expression of a man who has paid a debt he wasn't sure would be acknowledged, and has discovered that the acknowledgement feels less important than the paying. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Do the reassessments right." "I will. And the 2 candidates who come back, don't make it easy for them because you feel guilty. Hold the standard." His jaw tightened. "I know." "The standard is the thing," she said. "Not mercy, not compensation. The standard applied honestly. That's what protects everyone." He nodded. Once firmly, the nod of a man accepting an instruction he intends to follow. They stood for another moment. Then Halden said, "I should drive back. Early formation tomorrow." "Yes," she said. He turned to leave. 4 steps out, he stopped. He turned back. He came to attention. His hand went to his brow, precise and deliberate and unhurried. Not the organic, unplanned salute of a field full of soldiers on the day of the corridor. A chosen one. A considered one. The salute of a man who has thought about what the gesture means and decided it is accurate. Rowan looked at him for a moment. Then she returned it. He dropped his hand. He walked to his car. She watched him go, and then she turned back to the empty field and the large Nevada sky and the event schedule she'd been running through in her head. The Crucible started the next morning at 5:30. 500 new soldiers assembled in the pre-dawn quiet of Camp Granite Ridge. Different faces, different branches, different records, but the same particular focus of people who have spent years learning that attention is its own form of discipline. They stood in formation and waited for the briefing to begin. Calderon's evaluators were positioned at their stations. He stood at the edge of the staging area with a clipboard and the expression of a man who has thought carefully about what he is here to find and is confident for the first time in this role that he knows how to find it. Rowan was in the observer position at the gallery rail, high enough to see the full field, far enough to watch without intervening. She watched the formation settle. She watched the new competitors assess each other the way competitors always do. Reading rank. Reading build reading. The signals that people send when they are in a new environment, and still working out who they are in relation to everyone else. She watched a young female Navy operator standing 3 rows back, take in the assembled field, with the careful, complete attention of someone reading a room as a potential operational environment. She watched 2 soldiers near the front exchange a look when they noticed her. She watched the look travel. She watched it reach the ears of someone with a clipboard and an opinion forming behind his eyes. And she watched Calderon move, not dramatically, not with the intervention of someone stopping a scene, but simply stepping into a position that made his presence known, that said without words, "I am watching what you do next, and what you do next will be part of the record." The look stopped traveling. The formation settled. Colonel Pemberton, the same. Pemberton, the same economy of language, stepped to the front and delivered the briefing. He had added 4 sentences to it that hadn't been there the year before. 4 sentences that Rowan recognized from page 3 of her proposal. "We will measure what you do when the mission changes. We will measure what you do when correct is harder than fast. We will measure whether you protect the people beside you and the people behind you. We will measure what your strength is actually for." The formation listened. Rowan watched from the gallery rail and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the framework wasn't already saying more clearly and more permanently than any word she could have added. She thought about what she had told Owen on a ridge in Nevada 12 months ago, with a collapsed ravine below them and 6 more days of work ahead. A record tells people what you survived. Your choices tell them who you are. She thought about Halden's hand at his brow in the evening light. She thought about Owen's acceptance letter and Calderon's curriculum, and 3 candidates whose assessments were being reopened, and 2 who would return to a pipeline that now knew the difference between the standard and the idea of the standard. She thought about the 500 soldiers standing in the formation below her, and the 500 who had stood in the formation the year before, and the soldiers who would stand in formations she would never see in exercises. She would never observe making decisions that would be shaped by a framework that existed because 1 week in Nevada had revealed exactly what was missing from the one before it. The first event began. Rowan watched. She did not need to be on the field to matter to what happened on it. That was the final thing the Crucible had taught her, not about strength, not about endurance, not about the specific geometry of a steel frame, or the precise number of meters and obstacle corridor measures. About reach. About how far the right choice travels when you make it in front of the right witnesses. About the difference between proving something to a room and changing what the room believes. She had crossed a lane boundary 12 months ago and carried a man who doubted her to a finish line, and that single decision had moved through 500 soldiers and 11 million viewers, and a DoD committee, and a pipeline revision, and a training curriculum, and an evaluator certification program, and 4 sentences added to a briefing that 500 new soldiers were now hearing for the first time. Not because she was extraordinary, because she was right. And because being right consistently and visibly and at personal cost is the only argument that outlasts the people making the wrong one. Below her, the field moved. The Crucible ran. The framework held. Rowan Hale watched it all from the gallery rail and understood with the particular clarity that comes only after the work is done and the noise has settled